in your view, what's changed in the way that companies buy services, or the reasons that they buy services? Sorry, because if you take services on a very simplistic level, you could say it's just another means of getting work done. So you're getting things done, your work is being done. 60 years ago, that would have just been everybody in a kind of 9-to-5 job for life type situation. Why do you think this has changed? What's the difference now?
I think there's a few different factors, which basically everything that impacts how we procure physical goods has basically a lag effect in services, as far as I can see. So if you look at all the major trends from sort of the mid 20th century around outsourcing, globalization, especially to low-cost manufacturing regions, China being the obvious one. What you're seeing is all of the best practice that follows on with that has firms focusing on a set of core competencies and then looking for strategic advantage from those core competencies, and then looking for cost advantages on everything else. So if you look at in a manufacturing context, Apple's probably the best example. They might have assembly in California, but a lot of the sub-assemblies and everything they do further upstream is manufactured overseas and imported into the US and then finally assembled and sold. So if you look at globalization and outsourcing, what you've effectively got is easier access to lower labor costs, lower costs of capital, etc. And you kind of been seeing that. We've been seeing that for decades. And in fact, I think now we're probably seeing the backlash and some of the repercussions of that. And we're seeing nearshoring now re-emerging as a kind of a buzzword and a sourcing strategy rather than farshoring, offshoring, whatever we used to call it. I think we've sort of gone from, if you think about that period from sort of mid-century up until the end of the 20th century as the third industrial revolution. That is, we're starting to use computers, we're starting to use automation in a physical and a manufacturing context. We're sort of entering now the fourth industrial revolution is the buzzword for it, where we're seeing that in a cognitive context as well. So we're seeing the emergence of remote work. We're seeing, English is so prevalent now that you could basically hire from almost anywhere on earth and you'll find people speaking English that are able to engage with you as a supplier. But also, increasing focus, I think, on looking for, and this may be partially down to headcount constraints that some organizations have got, so you're limited in terms of the number of FTEs. It might be a requirement to convert fixed costs into variable costs, whatever it might be. We're seeing the same thing on the service side as well. So looking to gain access to either low cost or greater expertise alternatives from the supply market, rather than what we would traditionally have done, which is look in-house as the main source for that. And I think COVID has just put that obviously on at warp speed because of the massive shifts we've seen towards remote work. So it's much more, I think, acceptable to think that Silicon Valley, as an example, is likely no longer going to be the only place where you can find highly skilled developers and programmers and people in the tech field, because now you can effectively look to almost anywhere. So I think that globalization piece is really important, because if you're looking at a global workforce which is all on your payroll, you've got massive complications around tax. You've got all sorts of complications around payroll taxes, how they're managed from an HR perspective. When you look at your supply chain, you've got a lot more flexibility around that. So you start looking at the globalization piece, the outsourcing piece. We're seeing demographic shifts as well. So there's a lot more pressure on public services. So we're seeing that in the private context and in the public context as well. But the one that's really interesting for me from an FM standpoint is around servitization. So I think, Zivio is a perfect example of this. Zivio is a software as a service platform. So we're starting to see, I think, the manufacturers in the traditional sense, or developers, software developers, that could be, effectively you're seeing producers of physical goods, software, services, whatever it is, trying to engage more with the end customer. So I'll give a perfect example, I think, to illustrate this. So Rolls-Royce, which distinct from Rolls-Royce luxury cars, Rolls-Royce obviously does a lot around around jet engines and around, especially in the marine space. I think that's about half of their revenue today. Is, don't quote me on that, but somewhere in the region of 40 to 50%. But they do.
Fact checker.
Yeah, exactly. We need a Jamie. They produce diesel marine engines that go into ships, which are obviously critically important for shipping container loads of goods all around the world. They for a long time had this concept of power by the hour, and
Right.
a few years ago they signed an agreement with a Norwegian shipping line called Nordline, which is whereby they effectively, instead of selling the physical asset and then having third parties maintain that equipment, they use Internet of Things to get sensors on that equipment and effectively lease it by the hour, so that the customer's only paying for what they use. So if it's sitting in a dock, they're effectively, that's idle time. They're not paying for that capacity. But also the manufacturer's got access to enormous loads of data and can use predictive analytics to figure out when faults are going to occur. And, they've got much greater integration with that customer. So that's a really kind of gray area. And I guess we'll get onto this in a second, but that's a really gray area. Then is that a physical good being supplied, or is that a service? From both the perspective of the customer and the manufacturer, that's a service agreement now, because they're going to be measured on service levels rather than did they, deliver the good on time, was it to spec, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an
output. It's an output that leads, or it's a series of outputs that lead to an outcome. Effectively, that's what you're buying, rather than, you're not just buying a thing, you're buying power by the hour, effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. Because, from the customer's perspective, they don't necessarily want a diesel engine or a diesel generator. What they want is to move goods quickly and cheaply into port so they can sell them to an end customer. That's the output they're looking for. And if Rolls-Royce can support that, you've got much greater integration of the value chain. And I'm sure we'll get onto this, but much greater integration of the buyer and the supplier. So supplier relationship management becomes fundamental to making that service supply chain function properly.